So what exactly is gender ideology? You've probably heard the term, but you may not have heard a really precise definition. So let's just boil this down so you understand what's being claimed, what's being said. To understand gender ideology is really to understand a tale of two words in English. The first word is sex. Now, the problem with the word sex in English is that sex can refer to one of two things. It can refer to this biological reality of male and female, this reproductive strategy, this way that we're created, in which you have a male, which technically speaking is the member of the species that produces the small mobile gametes called sperm, and the female, which produces the relatively large, relatively immobile gametes called ova or eggs. So that's one definition of sex. But of course, sex is also used to refer to the sex act. And so for some people that can, be a little bit embarrassing. And so for centuries in English, we've had another word that is sort of a more modest word for the same thing. That's the word gender. All right. And so for a long time, believe it or not, these were more or less synonyms, sex and gender. And so you can look back centuries and see that people could refer to someone's sex, are they a male or female, or their gender. Those were just simple synonyms. And so that was happening for a long time. We're using both of those words. Everything was fine, wasn't confusing. We have lots of synonyms to refer to the same thing. And then sort of a subterranean movement intellectually happened when most of us were not paying attention, in which the word gender slowly came to refer to something else. Rather than being a synonym, people might be using it as a synonym for sex, but it's sort of like the tectonic plates that move mostly undetectably under the continents, the meaning of this word suddenly shifted. And most people were not paying attention, unfortunately. Now, that's the background. So here's the basic claim of gender ideology, never always made explicit, but I think you'll see this is what's going on once you hear it explained this way. The basic move or the basic claim of gender ideology is to say that sex as a biological category doesn't capture the reality of the human condition. And so instead of sex, for gender ideology, you get two other categories. Something called gender identity and something called sex assigned at birth. So rather than sex being something that we just observe, that's just a fact about us, we're either male or female, rather we have this thing called a gender identity, a so-called internal sense of gender that's unique to us. And so the only way you know someone's gender identity would be to ask them, okay, what do you identify as? So notice that's not the same thing as sex, a biological category. Gender identity here is a purely psychological state, purely subjective and internal. So that's the first category. And the second category is sex assigned at birth. So sex assigned at birth refers to the kind of external surroundings. And so rather than a doctor or a nurse or midwife observing what sex you are when you're born, the claim of gender ideology is that you're simply assigned a sex. So in other words, sexes are just stereotypes, and doctors look and based upon stereotypes associated with different types of body parts, they will assign you either male or female. But, and here's the kicker, your gender identity might be different than your sex assigned at birth. So in other words, you had your sex imposed upon you against your will, but what you really are is your internal sense of gender, your gender identity. That's the basic move of gender ideology. Sex is out, gender identity and sex assigned at birth is in. Now, this sounds so radical and crazy that I think it's important to see that this is exactly what's going on. And the easiest way to do that is really to just look at the most popular educational aids for teaching kids the mysteries of gender ideology. So a really popular diagram called the genderbread person found its way onto the internet a few years ago and has actually been through several different versions. It was developed by a guy named Sam Killerman. And the purpose of the genderbread person is just to teach young kids the basic ideas of gender ideology. So think of it this way, is for kids, instead of them thinking of themselves and their peers as boys and girls, the genderbread person teaches kids that they should think of themselves and everyone else in terms of these different aspects. So rather than boy and girl, you have a gender expression, a gender identity, you have an attraction, which you might call your sexual orientation. And then in early versions of the genderbread person, you have biological sex. Now, this initially is what people thought the claim of gender ideology was that you might have a gender identity, but you also have a biological sex. So all gender ideology is saying is that sex and gender are a different thing. That was the way most people kind of initially received this, and Sam Killerman, who was not educated using the genderbread person, that's how he understood it. What's funny, though, is that several different versions up until version 3.3 of the genderbread person came in for massive criticism by the more orthodox and committed gender activists and gender ideologues. Now, what would be the problem, do you think? It seems like that's sort of what's being claimed, that you might have a gender identity and you might have a biological sex. So what would be the problem with the genderbread person diagram from the perspective of someone who's fully committed to the whole program of gender ideology? Well, actually, there are several problems with his image from their perspective. Of course, the biggie is just simply that category of biological sex. That was a sort of outmoded, old way of thinking of things to refer to people as having a sex, right? As if being male or female was some fundamental reality. That was problematic. Something else that was problematic was that the identity was associated with the brain, right? Your brain is a biological object. It's still sort of tied to the real and observable world. Whereas gender identity, remember, is your internal sense of gender. So it can't be sort of identical with a physical object like the brain. And then finally, of course, the genderbread person looks a lot like a gingerbread man. That's obviously problematic from the perspective of gender ideologues. Well, and so about the time that version 3.3 showed up, a different diagram that was more in keeping with the sort of orthodox received view of gender ideology became popular. The so-called gender unicorn. Now, notice the gender unicorn, how it differs from that version 3.3 of the genderbread person. First of all, of course, you're dealing with a purple unicorn, so it's a mythological creature. Notice that the creature is androgynous. It's not obviously boy or girl. Notice that the brain is gone. Now you just have an ethereal thought bubble of a rainbow, right? So now we're purely in the immaterial realm of this internal sense of gender. Here's the thing I mainly want you to notice, is that whereas in the genderbread person version 3.3, we still had biological sex, with the gender unicorn, you have sex assigned at birth. So sex as a reality is now completely out of the picture, and a social construct called sex assigned at birth has replaced it. That is the best possible distillation of the fundamental claims of gender ideology in a single diagram. And of course, there's a bunch of other stuff that goes with this. Gender ideology requires all sorts of manipulations and distortions of language. So our meaning of sex, our meaning of gender, what we refer to people as, words like trans man and trans woman, and a trans man actually refers to a woman that's biologically, and trans woman, actually, that's actually a biological man that has transitioned to appear as a woman. And so the sort of essence of the ideology is to distort the kinds of language that we would normally use, so that gender identity is something entirely different than what we might be thinking of as biological sex. Now, with that background, you can suddenly understand why medical intervention, supposedly to treat a discordance in one's perceived gender, could be called gender affirming care. Gender affirming care, what that refers to, gender affirming care is not helping a child or an adult become comfortable with his actual sex body, so that if a boy feels like he's a girl inside, you might think the way to help that child would be to help him reconcile with his real body. No, gender affirming care says what you want to do is you intervene in such a way to affirm someone's internal sense of gender. So if someone assigned male at birth identifies as a female, gender affirming care requires social transitioning, in which you change his name to a female name and use female pronouns and have him go in the girl's bathroom. That's called social transitioning. And then if he's the right age, that can be followed by puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and then gender-affirming surgery. That sounds crazy. It sounds draconian to most people, but you can see why that makes sense in the thought world of gender ideology. If what you really are is your internal sense of gender, then the way to care for someone whose internal sense of gender is out of keeping with his or her sort of externals is to change the externals, change the name, change the social setting, change the body to conform to the internal sense of gender. Now, you might wonder, okay, but why would any parent ever agree to allow their children to submit to this kind of treatment? Well, most, of course, would not in the abstract. But part of the package in advocating gender-affirming care is this claim that children that are struggling in this way are at a much higher rate of risk of suicide than other kids. And so the only way really to reduce their suicidal ideation and the risk of them committing suicide is to allow them to undergo gender-affirming care. And so parents over and over are asked a question like this: do you want a live son or a dead daughter? In other words, if your only option as a parent is the risk of suicide for your child, then even radical surgery and drug interventions might seem tolerable if that's the alternative. That's the dilemma that gender ideology and gender-affirming care present for far too many parents.